Many people who are fans of the Legend of Zelda series were super excited when Breath of the Wild was released, marketed as a reimagining of the mechanics and approach typically found within the mainline Zelda games. For some reason, though, most people also expected to hear the same bombastic and heroic music accompanying this new direction in gameplay, and were disappointed to say the least when the game released with a much more sparse and ambient soundtrack. A huge change from the memorable and iconic melodies the series is known for. For some people, this move was sacrilege for the overarching Zelda musical lexicon and was shunned as being inferior or bad per se, while some didn't mind the change in musical direction and very few were willing to praise the soundtrack for the key strengths it brought to the overall experience. Let's take a look at why the soundtrack to Breath of the Wild was so effective in my eyes and doesn't seem to garner the praise that I and many other people think it deserves. First things first, to understand why the music in Breath of the Wild is so different, we need to know what the usual tropes present in Zelda music are. The reason Zelda music sounds like Zelda music is due to the unique musical identity crafted when the series began on the NES by Koji Kondo. Being a fantasy game, there are certain musical tropes specific to the genre that help to convey the overall message of the music to the listeners. Here's a few examples using well-known and iconic pieces from the series. First, let's talk about the instrumentation. Generally, real instruments and orchestral sounds are the way to go for fantasy music, and Zelda is no exception to this. Common features include big string and brass motifs used to convey action and drama in the music. Electronic sounds are still used, but these are much more common in the more dissonant tracks throughout the series, like dungeon themes for example. It's easy to find examples of big orchestral sounds in the series. Here's a few. Second aspect is harmony. The overall harmony in most of the Zelda games is pretty tonal throughout for the big memorable themes, but it's fleshed out with a healthy dose of mode mixture to generate more interest outside usual harmonic tropes. 1 to flat 7 chord vamps are common, a trope typical to adventure music, as is the famous Mario cadence, flat 6 to flat 7 to 1. These are all elements used to convey a sense of drama and emotion to the music in question. Here's a few examples of common chord progressions in Zelda music, specifically 1 to flat 7 vamps. last aspect we'll look at is melody, which is usually the most important because that's what tends to get stuck in your head forever. Melodies in the Zelda series range from emotional and touching to powerful and awe-inspiring, and a healthy balance is what sets apart a strong soundtrack. Accurately reflecting what's happening in the game through the music is the mark of a great composer, and everyone who's worked on the Zelda series ticks that box. There are literally a million to choose from, but here are a few key examples. With all these elements, we have the ingredients for both a typical Zelda and fantasy soundtrack. So, what did Breath of the Wild do with these ingredients that led to such a different dish? The most obvious and persistent complaint about the music in Breath of the Wild is the lack of any real strong melodies or themes familiar to the listener. Ironically, this criticism is also used against the game's dungeon design. A lot of people disapproved of the lack of traditional Zelda style dungeons. The big heroic themes we are often used to are missing and instead mostly replaced by sparse and ambient piano textures. While Breath of the Wild certainly shies away from using these familiar musical tropes in its composition, there are still instances of traditional bombastic Zelda orchestration sprinkled throughout the soundtrack. The game also presents the player with familiar themes from previous Zelda games, if you're willing to look hard enough. Instead of being obvious presentations of these previous musical ideas, they are presented more like a jigsaw puzzle that you need to solve through the use of a well-trained musical ear. Listen out for them. Another long-lasting criticism are the periods of gameplay where no music's heard whatsoever, leaving the player with only the ambient sounds of nature and Link's footsteps over the terrain. Personally, I think this was an extremely wise choice on the part of Nintendo. Can you imagine listening to the Hyrule Field theme from Ocarina of Time on loop for an hour as you mess about in the overworld or just explore? I know some people would probably have no problem with that, but there are just as many people who would find that to be pretty grating after a while. The first thing to mention is the complete change of the usual instrumentation of Zelda music present in the Breath of the Wild soundtrack. The large orchestral instrumentation is generally avoided, except in certain situations like attacking the divine beasts, in favour of the total harmonic power of the piano, often coupled with strings in certain instances. While this choice may seem counterintuitive to the greater work of the Zelda musical catalogue, think about the context of the game itself. Hyrule is in ruins after Link and the Champion's defeat 100 years ago. Ganon has effectively already won the battle. The use of solo piano playing sparse and ambient textures further reinforces this idea in the player's mind. The emptiness of the music reflects the emptiness of Hyrule after the Great Calamity struck 100 years prior. This is contrasted heavily when the full orchestra is featured, with this soundscape being used to reflect Link's struggle, like I previously mentioned, with the Divine Beasts, for example. This use of instrumentation highlights the current ongoing struggle of Link in general to defeat the Calamity before Ganon is released from Hyrule and the true apocalypse begins. The harmonic colour of the music in Breath of the Wild differs from most of the previous Zelda entries in general, as it is much more colourful and complex compared to the older games. I think you can clearly hear the inspiration from Impressionist composers such as Debussy and Ravel, a style of composition common in France during the beginning of the 20th century. Much of the music features heavy chord extensions with chords built in fourths and long bass pedal notes common to songs throughout the soundtrack. This use of complex chord with many different color notes creates more interest when the actual chords are being played. A smart choice considering how sparse and slow many of the songs on the soundtrack actually are. To contrast this, when we are presented with a piece of music that features more instruments and driving rhythms, the music tends to become somewhat harmonically simpler to cater to the use of fuller orchestration. This avoids overwhelming the listener with too much information on a first listening and creates a clear divide between the two predominant compositional styles on the soundtrack. The use of a clear melody is generally limited to areas that feature some sort of motif within the music itself, much of the ambient background music lacking any sense of melody whatsoever. The sense of nostalgia that many players were looking for within the music can often be found here, as most of the melodies featured are instantly recognizable within the Zelda series. This is one area where the composers really do manage to stretch the use of their material in an organic and natural way, reusing certain motifs with different settings or characters to create a connection between the two. Some examples would be the similarities between Sidon and Mipha's theme. Or the constant reoccurrence of the game's main theme during different sequences, such as Link's memory scenes. With all that's been said about the changes to the musical formula in Breath of the Wild, I think the way in which the player is even expected to appreciate the soundtrack has been changed significantly from the norm. With the music in this game, the focus has shifted from standout tunes to more organic pieces that blend and enhance the game environment in an effort to create a more complex and fluid experience when playing the game. If we look at the music from The Lost Woods, gone is the traditional rendition of the classic Saria's song, instead replaced with a more programmatic piece of music, more aimed at accurately reflecting the emotions and feelings the player should be experiencing during this section of the game. Contrast this approach with the music present at each of the stables, where we receive an oral treat in the form of an instantly recognizable melody, in this case Epona's song. The balance between these two approaches on the soundtrack is really worthy of praise in my opinion, as it requires real restraint to refrain from blasting the player with nostalgia overload using iconic melodies and chord progressions that the composers would be sure the players would recognize. I think it's fair to say then that the music of Breath of the Wild is definitely not bad, just underappreciated and misunderstood due to the purpose of the more quote-unquote random notes on a piano. Once you understand why the compositional attitude was shifted in this direction, you gain a greater understanding for the thought process behind the composition of the music. And let's not forget we're given plenty of memorable themes to recognize, usually they're just way less obvious than in previous iterations. In conclusion, I love the music from Breath of the Wild soundtrack. It mirrors the attitude that the developers had perfectly when creating the game by casting away all of the series traditions and trying something new in order to evolve the series. Satisfying a fan base as intense as the Zelda fan base is no easy feat, and the composers took a huge risk by skewing the traditional Zelda sound in favour of a more ambient one, but I believe this was the best approach to take for the game's soundtrack. As a listener, once you understand why these choices were made and you know what to look out for when listening, you gain a much better appreciation for the soundtrack instead of just unjustly playing it off as being bad. Let me know if your opinion on the soundtrack has changed after watching the video, or did you not understand anything of what I just said? Hopefully some of you now understand more about the music in general and will find new appreciation for it. Some of the songs in the soundtrack are beautiful in their own right after all. See you next time.